All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Farrish. I work with jetAVIVA. We're a broker in the United States. I have the distinct pleasure of doing about 80 to 100 airplanes a year for our clients, and a double-digit percentage of those are exports and imports. So you can imagine my pleasure that I get about half an hour of advice from some experts, and I don't think they're going to bill me, but we'll see. They said I can ask them anything I want as long as they know the answer. You guys are not bound by that, so ask away on Slido, and we have an initial poll question on there if you wouldn't mind answering it. We'll keep it off the big board until these gents introduce themselves. So, gents, if you don't mind, give us the quick who you are and what your role is in the import-export registration process. And Jack, might as well start with you.
Good. Okay. Jack Gilchrist. Is it not on?
There we go.
Hello. There it is. I'm Jack Gilchrist. I'm a lawyer in private practice, special FAA counsel, Oklahoma City. So we do really sort of the groundwork in connection with either export or import, depending on where the aircraft is going, but document preparation, title examination, that sort of thing. So we give people sort of advice in connection with the registration aspect of import and export.
I'm David Hernandez, and I'm a shareholder of the law firm Vedder Price. Vedder Price is probably the largest aircraft transaction law firm in the world, and I specialize in transactions, risk management, and a whole lot of other things. And with respect to import-export, just making sure there's no problems. Identify the issues, resolve the problems, make it as smooth as possible.
My name is Mike Bonventre. I'm a designated FAA representative for airworthiness. I do the airworthiness certificates, export C of A's, inspect the aircraft and ensure that it meets the type certificate data sheet, and make sure that the aircraft's safe for everybody.
Tobias Kleitman, founder of TVPX. We are, our anchor business is the owner trust business. We've got about 1,000 trusts with close to 1,300 airplanes in trust. We also have an integrated in-house customs brokerage, U.S. customs brokerage. So as it relates to imports and exports, sometimes the trust company will act as the importer or exporter for our customers that are placing aircraft in trust, and the customs brokerage will process those entries, either handling the import entries or the export filings when the aircraft are leaving the U.S.
Great. All right. David, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you because you're typically the pointy end of the spear in the whole process. What are the issues that you see? I mean, that's a compliment.
Okay, got it. I appreciate it.
What are the most? What are the issues that you see from your seat that slow things down the most when it comes to the export-import registration process?
I think the biggest thing is just lack of pre-planning. People don't understand the process. Everyone says speed kills deals, but lack of pre-planning kills deals as well. Hiring the wrong team of advisors. You can have a great broker, but if the broker doesn't know the requirements to export an aircraft or import an aircraft, you're going to hit a roadblock pretty quickly at a very critical phase. And so just plan. Have a discussion. Sit down with all of the team members and make sure that everyone knows what they're supposed to do and how it's supposed to happen. If there's liens on the aircraft, discuss that stuff. Have a checklist in place, go down the checklist and identify everything. But more importantly, know people in the country where you're buying the aircraft or where you're selling the aircraft into. So pre-planning is the biggest thing.
Great. What else do you guys have for us?
I got to go agree with the pre-planning. Call me up, say, I need to do an export C of A. Where, when, how? Is the aircraft in maintenance, out of maintenance? When was the last maintenance accomplished? They're not prepared. They just want an export C of A. Just doesn't. Or I'm going to register U.S. I need a C of A. I have no idea. There's no pre-planning to it. They don't give me any information.
That can be painful. Tobias, what about from where you sit?
Well, sometimes I would agree, and I think there's also some misunderstandings out there about importing and exporting, not so much from the professionals in the industry, but from the buyers and sellers. They don't understand that there's a difference between exporting an aircraft and getting an export C of A. A lot of people think, well, I have an export C of A, so I have exported the aircraft. Nothing can be further from the truth. There's actually another process. And I think that's because they use the word export with export certificate of airworthiness, the assumption is you've exported the aircraft. But there is an actual filing that has to be made that's very different than the process of what Michael does in issuing an export C of A. And you have a similar issue on the import process. And an import shouldn't get in the way of a closing. If the closing outside of the U.S., it closes and the U.S. buyer brings the aircraft to the U.S., hopefully they remember to do their customs entry. If the pre-buy is in the U.S., that's where people run into trouble. They really should land in the U.S., clear U.S. customs, and then go do their pre-buy. And some would argue, well, why would we do that if we don't know that the buyer is going to close? What if the deal craters and then we've got to export the airplane? But there's practical considerations. If the aircraft goes to the pre-buy, it might be at a facility where you can't clear customs at the time of the closing. And then the parties are faced with filing a late entry. Customs might say, well, why didn't you do this a month ago? That could trigger fines and penalties. And I'm sure people in the room have experienced well, I guess we'll just fly the aircraft out and then fly it back in and make entry, which is an expensive way to import an aircraft into the U.S. So that could slow things down unless you do it in advance.
Yeah, that's a distinct difference. The C of A, an export C of A that I produce is for airworthiness. It is not the customs. Right.
Yeah.
It's two different things. I'm doing airworthiness. He's doing regulatory.
Tobias, while I have you on the line, what is the result if you bring a plane into the United States without going through the proper customs stuff? What are the implications if you leave it there and never fly it back out, fly it back in, and try to sneak around? I'm asking for a friend.
If you get caught, there's potential for penalties and fines, and they're hefty. I mean, negligence by the letter of the law. The penalties start at 20% of the value of the merchandise. Well, the aircraft is the merchandise, and that is a lot of money in most cases. So whereas the solution is pretty simple if you do the pre-planning, as David says, and you get it done right. So it's not pretty.
Great. Jack, what are your major pain points?
Yeah, I think, well, as you were describing it, I think if David's the point of the spear, I'm the butt of the spear probably, but we're usually the grip, the handle. But the fact is that we're usually among the last to know that people want to either import or export an airplane, which we can work with in the sense that our work can be done quickly, assuming we have in hand the documents we need to do that. So documentation on our end, always in connection with registration. It's not airworthiness, that's handled outside at the location of the aircraft. But a lot of people don't know that certainly exporting an aircraft, you've got to have liens cleared. So if there's a mortgage on the aircraft, if there's a lease, even a lease outstanding on the aircraft, you've got to either have the consent of the parties, the lien holders, or the lessor, lessee, or you've got to have those liens removed. So that's a process for us too. Ordinarily, if I tell people if we have the documents in hand, the documents we need for closing, for export or import, we can usually get it done. Filing, we can usually get it done the same day, sometimes some within 24 hours of the time we file. So our process is easy, assuming we've thought, as David mentioned, thinking ahead, what's necessary. Is there a mortgage that has to be placed on the aircraft when it comes in? The lender is not going to let it happen. He's going to put the brakes on things if you don't have your mortgage in place, right, ready to perfect, or vice versa. If you've not paid the mortgage off going out, there's going to need to be the consent of the lien holder, and not only to the existence of the mortgage, but the fact that they've made provision for filing and perfecting that mortgage in the foreign jurisdiction where it's going. So again, planning ahead, but it's a matter, in my case, it's a matter of having documentation in hand and understanding what it takes to get that done. So, yeah.
Here's a question probably for the lawyers. This touches on a point you brought up, Jack, but one of my favorite scenarios is when the European lender who has a lien on the aircraft won't allow deregistration and won't remove their lien, which needs to happen first until escrow's fully funded or until the money's in their account, but the U.S. bank won't fund until the airplane's deregistered. So what do you do with that?
Yeah. There's,
Go ahead.
that's you, Dave.
Well, I mean, again, it's planning, right? So you look at the various roles. The bank's obviously going to control what's going on because they're not going to release their liens unless they're paid. And so you have a lot of discussions with the bank. I've never had an issue with U.S. banks or other banks, even European banks, working with us to understand the process and then just managing expectations with the client to say, look, yes, you're going to send the money, and after the money's received by the bank, they will release the lien. But I saw the question down there about discharging, other types of liens. Now, legitimate liens are fine, but when you have what we refer to as somewhat legitimate or speculative liens, like broker liens, other things, or mechanics liens, you have to actually file a process with the federal government, or excuse me, with the FAA, that has to be preceded by a state filing if they're state filings. And a lot of times you see brokers just filing lien, or mechanics or management companies filing liens that shortcut the process and just file it with the FAA. And so there's a law in the United States, it's called 18 U.S.C. 1001, where it's a criminal violation to file a lien improperly. It's a false statement. And so a lot of folks file these liens improperly. And the easiest way to discharge those liens is to call them up and say, look, I don't think you followed the process, and oh, by the way, I'm going to call the FBI and try to get you arrested. So you really want to reconsider this. And about 3 or 4 hours later, we get a call back saying, it's all good, lien's gone, we'll get rid of it. So if it's filed improperly, that's the quickest way to get rid of the lien. If it's filed properly, then you have to go through a specific process to discharge it.
Yeah, let me add to the question of the sort of the chicken and egg problem we get into with lenders and registration, deregistration, importing, exporting. I think certainly communication is a big thing. That is so open communication between the lenders. You've got the existing lender whose loan is going to be paid off, presumably, and then you've got the new lender who is going to pay off not only that loan, but part of the purchase price and so on. So communication is vital. They have to know, each has to know that the other exists. Each has to know sort of what's the status of that lien and so on. I think one thing that gives us a good deal of sort of flexibility these days is the Cape Town Convention, the International Registry. The fact that we can file prospective registrations so you can protect the incoming lender and their interests in connection with the aircraft equipment by filing a prospective registration. And often, again, with communication, you can carry that out between both the exiting lender and the incoming lender, the new lender as well. So I think that gives us another layer of communication. There's escrow of funds, which also helps, but often it's, as you said, the existing lender doesn't have any incentive to release their lien until they've got money in the bank. It's very little incentive in the process. So it's a challenge, but I think communication is vital in that process too. So.
So I think every single one of you mentioned the importance of preparedness. Obviously, the purchase agreement plays a huge part of that. And for people who aren't familiar with the import or export process, and actually I was shocked to see that over half the folks in here on the poll results had not been involved with an import or export last year. Folks, I guarantee you that no number will be lower this year than last year. Obviously, as planes get picked through in the United States, people necessarily have to go further and further afield to find aircraft. So in our business, we see that picking up. But when it comes to the purchase agreement, Toby, from the customs import aspect, what are the variables that are important to you to be in a purchase agreement? for folks, shifting from side to side responsibilities, duties?
Well, I think from an import perspective, you can define in the purchase and sale agreement who's going to be the importer on an import. And that's something that the parties have to discuss. A foreign seller might say, well, we don't want to be the importer. We don't have a U.S. presence. We don't have a tax ID number. The U.S. buyer might say, well, we're not sure we're going to buy this. We've got to look at the airplane, and so we don't want to be the importer. The fact is that anybody with a financial interest in the transaction can be an importer. A non-U.S. company, if they don't have a tax ID number, they can get what's called a customs assigned number, which is a substitute for a tax ID number. They can get a customs bond, and they can be an importer. Now, they may say, look, we've got 5 more buyers lined up, so if you really want the airplane, then you should be the importer. It's something that has to be negotiated between the parties, and that can be defined in the purchase and sale agreement, for sure.
Great. What, David and Jack, from your end, are there any key points that, for people who are used to doing strictly domestic deals or strictly intra-EU deals, are there any points that people often overlook? What are they?
So from my perspective, and literally, folks in this audience give me a call maybe once or twice a year and say, hey, I found a great plane, I purchased it in Florida. It's been sitting there a while, what do I do? Or are there any concerns? So the thing that you have to worry about dealing with planes in the States when you buy them, there's these vicious people called state tax auditors. So state sales and use tax, and Florida is one of the pit bulls in the United States of collecting taxes. And so if you close a deal in a particular state, the first thing you need to ask for and watch out is, am I subject to the state tax? People think, well, hey, I'm a European, I'm not a US citizen, I don't have to pay taxes. That's not the case, you certainly do. And they will file a lien on your aircraft. They're very vicious, and these, 6 to 8% of the purchase price of the aircraft. So, you get these calls, and I hear silence on the other end when I just say what I just said. And then they'll get back to me, and a couple months later, like, we might have an issue. Because what they do is they stop at the airports, look at the tail number, and then send you a letter. So that's the biggest thing, of just watch out for the tax issues. Planning ahead, if you need an export C of A, most of that's done early on. I mean, like I said, I talked with Tobias, and now that he's got the export stuff up and running, it's great, import, export. Just ask questions, and I'll do a shameless plug here, self-interest. I'm actually right now looking for a DAR for a Bell 412 in Japan. So if you have any recommendations, I'd love it. Bell 412 DAR in Japan. But just planning, that's it. The key thing.
And I'm looking for the winning lotto ticket numbers, but so if you guys have that, let me know as well.
Right.
I was going to say just one thing. If you want to determine whether an export or an import is required, there's 3 simple questions. Where is the airplane now? Where is the closing going to take place? Where is it going to be based after closing? The answer to those 3 questions will reveal whether you need to do an import or an export in and out of the U.S. And then you can ask the question, what's the current registration and what's the registration going to be in the future if it changes? And that will determine whether you need an export C of A or a standard C of A. Those simple questions are very revealing.
Yeah, they get complex, though. Let me add to that, and that's a great summary of the situation. But also, the other key in there is how's the plane going to get from the country of export to the country of import, and what's your timing? Because therein is it can be a $1 million question if you end up with a plane that's deregistered in the United States, for instance, and it's going to Europe. The answer, it's got to be registered someplace in order to be operated between points A and B. Any place to be operated, any place has to be registered in a jurisdiction. I got kind of tickled by a conversation I had with somebody who was let's just say new to the business, and they told me that we've decided we're going to put the plane on the international registry in the meantime. And I said, that's not a thing. That won't work. That doesn't help. But anyway, it sounded good. It would be great if it did work. But I think that's the key that's a key in the import-export process is knowing where does a plane need to be for the DAR to inspect it if it's a U.S.-based, and what's the timing of that, and how are we going to get it there, and it's got to be registered someplace.
Jack, that's funny because usually we have clients who tell us the international registry is not a real thing and they're not paying $800 to enroll. But
They're not doing it.
the tables have turned. We've got a question up here that's a good segue for Mike and a follow-up to what you were mentioning, Jack. Can a DAR issue an export C of A after an aircraft has been sold to the foreign buyer? And Mike, I know you've seen that go wrong.
Yeah, that's I don't know how to answer that question correctly. The foreign buyer who's the aircraft registered to?
Right, that's the trick of the question.
That is the trick of the question. The foreign buyer, if it's in a trust, yes, it's still U.S. registered. I will then issue an export C of A to the registered owner.
Right.
And the registered owner could be a trust or a U.S. citizen, an individual U.S. citizen. So really, a foreign buyer doesn't mean anything at this point because it's got to be U.S. registered in order for me to issue it. For it to be U.S. registered, it has to be in a trust or an individual, U.S. individual. Did I answer that?
If you assume that it's the foreign buyer is going to register it in a foreign jurisdiction, then the answer is no. You won't get on a plane, right, that's not U.S. registered, right? It's something that's been canceled off the U.S. registry.
If it's been taken off the U.S. registry, they've done it. I can't do anything with the aircraft.
Yeah. Timing
it's already deregistered.
Yeah, then timing and communication, and back to David's original point, is planning in advance. It's planning in advance. How am I going to get an export C of A? I can only do it while it's still in our example, while it's still on the U.S. registry, because that's the only time you can get a U.S. representative to issue a certificate of airworthiness is when it's U.S. registered.
Yes.
So,
And the quickest way to resolve that issue is put it in the agreement, right? So if you're buying an aircraft, you always want to have the seller responsible for the export C of A. You just write it in there. If you're a buyer selling a plane, you really don't care. And ideally, you're like, nah, I'm not even going to mention it. And when the deal closes, they're going to come back with that same question. I need this export C of A. What do I do? You're like blocked on their phone. They don't even know who you are anymore. They've got the money. The deal's done. So put it in the agreement. Specify seller will issue the export C of A.
Like I said, David's the pointy end of the spear.
Well, I mean, that's an easy one. I think you got to get that taken care of.
Mike, you're the last piece of a puzzle between turning a multi-million-dollar paperweight into a flying machine. By show of hands here, who's heard of an export C of A? Actually, let me ask, who has not heard of an export C of A? You guys too shy? Mike, or actually anyone, give us a quick, what is an export C of A as opposed to a regular C of A? And when is an export C of A needed?
Export C of A is needed when it's going to a different registry.
Right.
A standard C of A is to operate on U.S. registry to operate the aircraft anywhere in the world, but it's a standard C of A.
And literally, we're going through this process right now. So we need two steps. We need an export C of A from the Japanese government to the U.S. So that's the first step. Seller's responsibility, full stop. I'm not going to do the deal unless you issue that. And then we have to hire a DAR on our own dime to bring someone into Japan to issue a U.S. C of A once it goes on the end registry. And all that's happening outside the U.S., different time zones. It's not very fun. But that's the process that we're dealing with now. And it's virtually identical everywhere in the world.
There's a great question here at the bottom. Will an export C of A ever come wrapped in a red bow? Now, you can get close, right? I mean, for an export C of A to come wrapped in a red bow, which is essentially saying what is the easiest, least painful way with the least amount of brain damage, what needs to happen?
What needs to happen is to have preparedness again. There is people that will go and look at aircraft and set the aircraft up for the export. If somebody says, yeah, I can do that, and the first question is, when was the last time you did it? Have you ever done it? Because you do need people that have experience. It's just show up at an aircraft and everything's still in boxes, and oh yeah, all the documents are there, and the broker is nowhere to be found, and the actual director of maintenance for the aircraft, that he's already gone because his boss told him go home because he's no longer paying him to manage the aircraft. Right. So you got to do your homework. It's just prepare. If you contact me, I do send a checklist and just have everything ready before I show up.
That's great. You know, again, with the preparedness aspect, you know, if you take any of these steps out of order, you can really foul up the whole process. You know, Jack or David, are you able to just give us a 45,000-foot view? This is a really nice airplane. A 45,000-foot view on steps and the order that needs to happen to make sure things aren't messed up and Mike's left standing, unable to issue an export C of A, or excuse me, a C of A?
Sure. So it starts with the checklist. You know, I'd be glad, I have no loyalty or, you know, a checklist is a checklist. Make sure it's all there. As we all know, clients don't have don't know every step in the process. So, but you want to manage expectations. And if a deal's going to require a lot of import and export concerns, add time to the deal, maybe a week or 2 weeks. If you have financing, add another week. If you have double financing, maybe add more time. But go through that process, and again, how do you put planning into paper? You just do step by step. You either write it down on the flight home or you do it during our breaks. But you just plan for it, and big picture, you kind of know when something's going wrong and you try to manage it. You have calls with Mike or Tobias or Jack and just say, look, something seems right here. You know, is this nonsense? But go through that process and do it all the time until a deal's done.
Yeah, and I don't think I probably wouldn't be that quick to be able to put together a sort of a high-level list, but I do think one thing that is definitely true is get counsel, which means different things to different people. There are a lot of people that do a lot of this stuff. That is, there's a good number of people that are quite familiar with the import process or the export process, and I still suggest that they get counsel in the process, but they're going to need less, right? That is, but everybody needs somebody else to look at the process from a high level and say, here's what all we need to be considering in the process of export or import, and get somebody who's looking at it, who knows what's going on in that. I think that's really invaluable, you know, in the process of importing or exporting.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I was thinking about this. Watch out for material full stop events. When I say that, tariffs. I don't know, many of us aren't doing commercial deals, but if you're doing commercial deals, you're going to get whacked with a 15 to 25% tariff on any European or Airbus things coming in, so watch out for tariffs on big planes. And export control issues. If one of the parties in the deal are on the SDN list or the OFAC list or the BIS list, those are full stop events. You can't even negotiate with those folks. So, and that just, you're done. You have to walk away. And hopefully you have the contract written such that you get your deposit back if you're buying.
Great. David, I'll echo what you said about educating your clients and planning ahead. We had an aircraft that we were importing to the United States in December, coming from a European country that will not be named. And I think all of their carrier pigeons were on holiday, so they used the Aeronautical Fixed Telecommunication Network. I still don't understand what that is, to communicate with the FAA, the deregistration. So some of these countries obviously take longer than others to fulfill their obligations. So again, educating your customers, clients is pretty important. Jack, anything that you want to just walk us through briefly, the order that the things need to happen as far as who, what, when of the process?
Well, I can speak to it from my perspective out of Oklahoma City, which is, again, we're going to be looking at title and registration issues. Right. But the earlier we're aware of the process, the better off we are. We have a chance to in the case of an aircraft that is on the U.S. registry, the chance to examine title, to look to confirm what, if any, there are in the way of outstanding liens, again, mortgages or leases or non-consensual liens, mechanics liens and so on. And then to give counsel in connection with what the sale and cancellation of registration process is going to be, which again, it's not brain surgery, but it's something that the earlier we know, we can get our ducks in a row and do that, because we prepare a letter, either one or two letters, depending on the current owner of the aircraft, to cancel registration, and we get those ready in a way that they're going to go to the FAA, and the objective is, at the time we file, we know that everything is with the FAA that's necessary to get them to agree with us to cancel registration and to notify the foreign jurisdiction. So again, knowing early, we can get things set up, and it happens quickly when that's the case. Again, a fast process.
Great. All right, well, last Slido question, and any questions from the room before we have run off to lunch, Alistair? 1 minute. 1 minute. All right, let's... Oh, one more session. Whew. Oh, I'm teasing you with a good time. I'm sorry.
Joking.
Yeah, so can we get the last Slido question up there? And then, any questions from the room? Who's brave?
Does the issue of an export to the U.S. imply guaranteed aircraft meets requirements?
Yes.
Or the last Slido poll, we had one more polling question.
Can you put that question back on there so I can read it?
It's coming.
Okay.
Does the issue of an export CVA to the U.S. imply, oh, it's gone. Here we go. Here we go. Which process is, oh.
Does the issue of an export CVA, no, so you have an export CVA from a foreign registry to the U.S.
Part one.
Employ a guarantee the aircraft meets the requirements of the issue of an FAA CVA. Even though they've done the export, and hopefully they've met the bilateral agreement, the aircraft still may not be ready for, be able to be issued a C of A.
That's a second step.
Because there may still be more work to be accomplished to the aircraft, modifications or anything, because I'm trying to give an example. There may be a modification that needs to be accomplished to the aircraft in the United States, as opposed to in a foreign registry, because there's certain, at one time there were certain parameters on the flight data recorder that had to be on, and one registry had that and the other registry didn't, so the flight data recorder had to be upgraded. Just a short example. There is some differences.
But two-step process. So the export C of A isn't the guarantee, but the C of A is. Once you have a C of A, that means you can put it on the FAA registry.
No, actually, you have to be on registry before I can issue a C of A.
Okay, well.
Well, I'm thrilled that you gentlemen have done such a good job explaining things that it's about as understandable as impeachment right now in the United States. And clearly, Brexit has us beat, so you're doing a great job. I appreciate it. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.